Hello, my name is Thomas Prymak. I'm a scholar at the University of Toronto. I'm a research associate of the Chair of Ukrainian Studies in the Departments of History and Political Science there. And I've just published an article online about Ukrainian libraries in Canada and the present crisis that confronts them. The article is entitled "The Crisis Continues," because this crisis is actually gone on for quite a while now and is only getting worse. So what is the crisis? The crisis mostly concerns the closure of Ukrainian libraries in Canada, the decline of attendance and use of books, the closure of the libraries, and the fate of those books, what the fate of those books will be. And each library in Canada is a little bit different. Some are smaller, some are a bit bigger, some are affiliated with various institutions, and at least one is independent. So what happens to the books when a library closes? Very often they're dispersed in various directions. Nobody really takes centralized control of these books and ensures that they're preserved. There are two reasons for this. The first reason has to do with the transfer to the internet of so much information and media technology. Books and images are now, texts and images are now available on the internet. They're available in ebook form. They're available on Google Books and many other forms and many other platforms. And so that the traditional book, the printed book, has lost some of its older functions. It's become more of an artifact, or shall we say, an artifact as well as an older form of media. So the question is, what do we do with these books that are left over from earlier times? What are their value? And should they be preserved? We have to ask first. And if so, how? So all of those questions are dealt with in my article. And I survey a number of different libraries that I've used over the years and look at what's happened to them over, say, the last 20 or 30 years. So that's basically what the article is about. The question about the number of Ukrainian libraries in Canada, private libraries in particular, is very, very difficult to answer. They've never really been counted. And so what I've done in my article is just discuss those libraries that I've visited over the years and used over the years, and over a very long period of time, actually, over, say, the last 40 years or so. So these, and typically, a Ukrainian library in Canada, a private Ukrainian library in Canada, will be located in a city, usually a bigger city like Toronto or Winnipeg or Edmonton, which has an active Ukrainian community in it. Or I suspect as well there are some Ukrainian libraries, private Ukrainian libraries in smaller cities such as, we'll say Saskatoon or some of these smaller towns on the prairies, which at one time had very active Ukrainian communities, active cultural institutions. But over the years, these have declined and passed away, and the libraries have closed down. So it's very, very difficult to estimate how many private libraries there are in Canada. Also, there are different kinds of private libraries. On the one hand, there are institutional libraries affiliated with Ukrainian institutions, such as, for example, the Mohyla Library in Saskatoon, which is affiliated with the Mohyla Institute, a student residence, an Orthodox student residence in Saskatoon. Very, very old library in Canada. It dates back to just around the First World War period. Contains many treasures, some of them dating back that far and even further. And then there are private libraries in private hands, in the hands of individuals. We don't know really very much about these libraries because they've never been surveyed, and they would be very difficult to survey. So we really can't answer the question as to how many Ukrainian libraries there are in Canada. But there are many, and there are still some affiliated with various institutions, such as the Mohyla Institute in Saskatchewan, such as the St. Vladimir Institute in Toronto, or the Oseredok Library in Winnipeg, and there are others in Alberta and elsewhere. So that's the general field. Now, as to the question of which are the greatest treasures in those libraries, again, this is a difficult question to answer because they've never really been surveyed. Very few of these libraries have catalogs that are online, and so you can't really tell what's in them. And on top of that, even if you visit those libraries, very often the catalogs are not kept up to date, and we don't really know the exact holdings of those libraries. So it's all an open question. And my article was faced, when I was researching that article, I was faced with those problems, discovering the answers to those questions. And what I did was, the way I tackled it was, I recounted my experiences at various of these libraries across Canada. Libraries in Toronto, libraries in Manitoba, and libraries in Saskatchewan. Because I have never done research in Alberta, I couldn't cover Alberta. But I covered libraries in those three provinces, and I covered some very important libraries as well. Some of them very, very old, dating back, as I said, to the First World War. Others more recent, dating back to the post-1945 era. So, and the Cold War. So those are the types of things that I did. The older libraries had very rich collections of older Ukrainian Canadiana. For example, one of the first things I came across in my search for Canadiana was a very old edition of the Kobzar by Taras Shevchenko, Ukraine's national poet. It was published in Winnipeg in 1918, possibly the very first Kobzar ever published in Canada, and perhaps one of the first in North America, I don't know. But it was a very old publication, printed on slightly acidic paper, so it was already disintegrating, and had an introduction by the very prominent Ukrainian literary scholar Bogdan Lepki. So that was an interesting kind of publication. And when I looked into it further, and I flipped through it, I discovered that it had been published, it had been printed actually, at the printing shop located at what later became the Ukrainian Labor Temple in Winnipeg, the biggest Ukrainian labor temple in the country. Now, Bogdan Lepki was never a communist. The Labor Temple turned out to be a communist organization in later times. So what is the story behind this publication? We don't really know. But it's interesting that during those very early days, there seemed to be cooperation, or at least no split, between those people who admired Taras Shevchenko and were not socialistically inclined, and others who were socialistically inclined and became communists in later years. So those are the kinds of stories that come out of research like this, and sometimes they're entirely unexpected, as was the case in this particular Kobzar. One of the peculiarities of this this research was that one of the most recent, perhaps the most recently established of these libraries that I looked at was the library of the Toronto Ukrainian Library Association. And it was established as late as the 1980s, late 1970s and early 1980s. And it was actually the spark that set me on this, on the course to writing this article, because that library is presently in danger of disappearing completely. The Library Association has decided to dissolve itself, and perhaps ship all the books off to Ukraine. So they invited me to come in and take a look at the library and see what they had. Now, because it was one of the most recent Ukrainian libraries established in Canada, long after the immigration of the most recent, well, almost the most recent immigration, but the post-1945 immigration to Canada, and not the pioneers or the interwar people, but one of the most recent immigrations to Canada, I thought that this library would have pretty much an interest in the post-war politics, in politics during the Cold War and that sort of thing, emigre literature and political tracts and criticism of the Soviet Union and all that sort of thing. Well, it did have all of that. But surprisingly, it also had a very rich collection of very old Ukrainian Canadiana, dating right back to before the First World War, to the pioneer era, Now, where that came from, I don't know, but there was a lot of it, and it was not catalogued. It was in poor condition. Again, most of it printed on very acidic paper and crumbling. So we don't really know the details about that, but it's there, and it should be, in my opinion, it should be kept in Canada until we know what it is, and perhaps preserved in some appropriate place. Now, the Tula people, the people who run the library, were arranging to transfer as much as they could to other libraries here in Toronto, especially the University of Toronto Library. The University of Toronto Library is a magnificent library, really, and it takes very good care of its books, puts them in acid-free binders and rebinds them if it's necessary and that sort of thing. And sometimes it even digitalizes them. So that was a very wise move. But the University of Toronto Library can't take everything. So a representative of the university came, took a look at the library, and took a few items to be transferred to the university. But what about the rest of the collection? Thousands of books, thousands of pamphlets, hundreds of periodicals, dozens of newspapers. Where does all of that go? It's all in danger, and somehow I think we ought to try to preserve them. The question of some kind of central organization or communication, center of communication between various librarians, among various librarians and libraries in Canada with a Ukrainian interest is an interesting one, and such an organization does not exist, such an institution does not exist. There are informal contacts, of course. For example, librarians here in Toronto mostly know each other, and some of them know Ukrainian librarians elsewhere in the country. But it's a very haphazard type of thing. Sometimes you know somebody, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you met somebody at a conference, and sometimes you don't. So that's the general situation. And I know it's unsatisfactory, but people do their best under difficult circumstances. Remember, these libraries, for the most part, are terribly underfunded. Most of them don't have the money to pay for professional librarians. They rely on volunteer help, and all of that is very haphazard. Very often the volunteers are not properly trained, if you can even get them. And another great problem that I saw with the private Ukrainian libraries in Canada is with acquisitions, recent acquisitions. For example, in the past, they may have had a very good librarian who nicely cataloged everything and placed it on the shelf in the right place. But that librarian, the funds dried up, that librarian disappeared, and new acquisitions come in, and they're not cataloged. So we don't even know what the library has acquired over the past dozen years or so. And many libraries in Canada are in that condition. For example, one that comes to mind immediately is the Library of Oseredok, the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center in Winnipeg. It's a truly magnificent library. It dates back to 1944. During the war. It was originally affiliated with the Ukrainian National Federation of Canada, but over the years it's loosened that affiliation. It's pretty much an independent institution now. Well, for many years they had very good librarians, professional librarians, who cataloged everything, shelved everything properly, saw that everything was properly done. Recently they haven't had the money to pay a professional librarian. The result is new acquisitions are coming in, and we don't really know what's happening to them. So they need the money to hire a librarian to bring things up to date and put them in order. But I must stress that Oseredok, the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center Library in Winnipeg, is a magnificent old institution with a well-ordered library up to a point that goes right back to the interwar years, and in some respects to the pioneer period before that. Remember that Winnipeg was this first center of Ukrainian publishing in Canada and remained predominant right until the 1970s. So very many Canadian imprints in the Ukrainian language were printed in Winnipeg and acquired by Oseredok. So they have all that material, and if it was acquired during the period when they had good librarians running the place, it's still on the shelf and it's in the right place. So it can be used by researchers. So that's the situation with that particular library. And I suspect that there are other libraries in the country in a similar situation. One way that the librarians and the people who run these libraries have responded to the crisis is firstly looking around to see if there was anybody nearby who would look after these books, people with experience with books, respect for books, who would try to preserve them, and they would distribute those books to those people. But they couldn't; such people couldn't take it all. So eventually, the people who ran these libraries would throw up their hands and say, "Well, let's ship it all off to Ukraine. They can use it there." Well, that's one solution, all right, because in some parts of Ukraine they're short of Ukrainian books. But there are lots of problems with that as well. For example, in Ukraine, how do they handle Ukrainian Canadiana? Material printed in Canada in the Ukrainian language, and not specifically about Ukraine, but about, say, politics and the immigration or life on the prairies during the first half of the 20th century, all that sort of thing. How do they handle that sort of thing? And I think that material in particular is in danger of perishing if you simply ship it all off to Ukraine, or simply getting lost somewhere in the pipeline. So it's very important to think about who you're shipping the books off to, the institution in Ukraine that receives it. Can the institution handle that material? Will it handle it properly? Will it digitalize it, for example? And does it have the manpower? Does it have the finances? And will it actually carry out the promises that it makes when it first receives the material? Those are all problems faced by librarians in Canada at the present situation with regard to the decline and the disappearance of these very old Ukrainian libraries in Canada. So what to do about this crisis? Well, there are a number of things that can be done. Firstly, of course, there is the problem of space, shelf space, space for computers, that sort of thing. All of this is very rare in these private Ukrainian libraries in Canada. Most of them don't even have their material online. So something should be done about that, first of all. I think that money is a big problem for many of them. For example, the situation of Oseredok, which is getting to be critical, could be greatly alleviated if they had the money to hire a professional librarian archivist, or a librarian and an archivist to handle that material. They could put the materials in order, bring them up to date, and perhaps begin to put them online. And also put the catalog online, I mean. And also they could begin to digitalize certain very rare items that they think that they might hold and nobody else holds, so that it could be made available to the Ukrainian research community in general. So that's one thing that can be done. There are people in Canada, young graduates of, for example, of the library science program at the University of Toronto, who read Ukrainian well, know Ukrainian materials, and would be very comfortable working in that kind of environment. But there's no money to hire them at many of those institutions. So money is a very important problem there. I believe that Oseredok in particular does have a regular budget, does have a plan. But remember, it's a large institution. It's I think a 5-story building with an art gallery, a museum, archives, and a library. And it only has one paid individual that I know of. That's the director. Now everything else is done by volunteers. There are volunteer accountants helping with budgetary matters, and volunteers who help out in the boutique and that sort of thing. But it's very hard to put everything together in a proper manner without funds to begin with. So they need to start step by step, you know. And I think that After they make those first steps, then they can hire a librarian, and they need enough money to do it for several years. Yes, I agree with you there. A one-year term is not going to do it for Oseredok or a library that large. They need somebody funding for, say, 10 years at least. If they could get funding for 10 years for a librarian archivist, that would be wonderful, and I think that would bridge the gap until the crisis reaches a different stage, should we say, or it is eliminated completely. Other libraries are already, you know, they're being dismantled as we speak. The Tula Library here in Toronto is being dispersed. They're doing their best to identify the rarest items in it and make sure that they're preserved and put online. They're cooperating with the UNF library here in Toronto, the Ukrainian National Federation Library, which already has a digitalization program. And they're trying to coordinate back and forth so they don't duplicate any of the work. But of course, a larger organization which could centrally plan these things for all Ukrainian libraries in Canada, or at least all the major ones, would be a desirable thing. You know, but the situation is very serious. It's already gone quite far. Many libraries have already closed. For example, one of the first private Ukrainian libraries I ever visited, although I didn't directly use it, was the Ukrainian National Home Library in Winnipeg. It was a magnificent old library. Yaroslav Ronitsky talks about it in his survey of Ukrainian libraries that he did in the 1950s. And he described it as the best organized, most heavily used Ukrainian library and the richest Ukrainian library in Canada. It's gone. It no longer exists. And there are many other libraries like that no longer exist, especially in the smaller cities in Western Canada, where there was once a vibrant Ukrainian community, and that community no longer is there. So all of those types of libraries either have already disappeared or are in the process of disappearing. So the situation is very serious. It's a very big problem for those who love books and don't want to see them destroyed. And of course, there are many of us around who do love books and want to see them preserved. So it's a serious problem for us. Acquisition of books. Very often these libraries are deposit boxes for elderly Ukrainians here in Canada who can see the end coming for themselves and want to see their books preserved. So they take them to these libraries, drop them off and say, here, you look after them and pass them on to the next generation. And so, for example, the library that you mentioned, the Tula Library here in Toronto, has many books that have been dropped off like that, but they haven't been cataloged. Many of them are still in boxes. We don't know really what's there. So it's hard to say what should be done with them. It's a very difficult situation. Perhaps as much as 100,000 books might be at risk of being lost and destroyed at the present time in Canada, and the situation is very serious indeed. As to the number of libraries, each Canadian city probably has a different number, but there are several here in Toronto, there are several in Winnipeg, there are a few in Montreal, there are at least one very important library in Saskatoon, in Saskatchewan, and there are several in Alberta as well. We don't really know much about these books because some of them are donated by elderly people, dropped off at libraries, and the libraries don't have the funds to hire librarians to access them and catalog them properly and put them on the shelf. And all of these things, and there might be many treasures among them, are presently in danger of being destroyed, discarded, or simply lost. One possible solution to this crisis, and it's a very serious crisis indeed, is the establishment of some kind of central institution, properly funded, which can determine which libraries are in greatest danger and which books are in greatest danger of disappearing. To cover all of the Ukrainian libraries in Canada would be a very difficult thing, but to cover the most important ones, say in Montreal, in Toronto, in Winnipeg, in Edmonton, and Saskatoon, is a doable thing. And perhaps with $5 to $10 million, these libraries can be saved. Librarians can be hired. Professional librarians who know what they're doing can be hired and the books can be preserved so that future generations can enjoy the fruits of the work of the earlier Ukrainians in Canada, who themselves worked very, very hard to put these libraries together and really did a marvelous thing for Canadian culture, which in my opinion should really be preserved.